Let's imagine a scenario like this one. You take a region brimming with natural resources, a region where the vast majority of countries share a language and a similar culture, a region with a relatively young population, reasonably good environmental conditions, and above all, a region that over the last 120 years has not been subjected to any major wars. I don't know, given such a description, I'm pretty sure we can all agree that region seems ideal for growing businesses and reaping prosperity all around, right? Well, nothing could be further from the truth. As you probably all already know, the region I have described is precisely Latin America. And the reality is that things are totally at odds with the conditions described. The economic history of this region is something of a constant disappointment. Let me explain. Yes, Latin America, like the rest of the world, has grown a lot in recent decades. However, as you can see on the screen, unlike in other parts of the world, every time this region goes into fifth gear, something suddenly happens that makes them step on the brakes. Look, for example, at how differently it has evolved compared to China. Not to mention the persistence of poverty, frequent revolutions, dismal public accounts, and inequality. Some countries still even have severe nutrition problems. It's crazy. Of course, all of this has meant that the leading countries in the region, those that were once even richer than countries like Poland or South Korea, have fallen far, far behind. And all this has a lot to do with a kind of political and economic disease. We're talking about the most customary product of all Latin America, populism. Oh, those great messiahs who promise to bring about a revolution that will fix everything. Yes, as we know, populism is neither a new phenomenon nor something exclusive to this region. In fact, it is a global phenomenon. However, it is precisely here in Latin America where it has developed the most. We could almost say that populism is to Latin America what cars are to Germany or oil to Saudi Arabia. It is a local specialization. Here we find them of all colors: left-wing, right-wing, civilian, military, democratic, authoritarian, and even first and second generation. From Argentina's Juan Domingo Perón to Bukele's most recent crypto obsession to the well-known Rafael Correa, Evo Morales, or Hugo Chavez. History is replete with messianic leaders who promised great revolutions for achieving social justice, but who, nevertheless, ended up creating a bigger mess with great crises, hyperinflation, repression, and a lot of poverty. In other words, Latin American populism practically always, if not always, achieves the opposite of the desired result. So the question is, why on earth does Latin America's economic history always end the same way, with a huge disappointment? Well, as you probably guessed, we're going to take a look at that right now. This is Visualeconomik. So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, what exactly is populism? Can we really differentiate it from other political and economic currents? I don't know. Isn't every good politician supposed to be a populist at heart? Well, the truth is that giving an exact definition is not an easy task. So far, many experts and analysts have tried to do so, usually with quite a lack of precision. Perhaps a description like this one would be a good approximation.
Populism is the phenomenon whereby a politician attempts to gain power with broad promises of benefits and concessions to the lower classes. Edwin Williamson, historian specializing in Spanish America.
Be that as it may, beyond these definitions, populism does have a series of common traits that we can all identify. A charismatic leader who exercises strong and personalistic leadership, and that uses a discourse that polarizes between the good and the bad, between the people and the anti-people, and that usually targets the elites, big business, banks, or institutions such as the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. For these leaders, these agents are always responsible for all social misfortunes.
To be rich is bad. It is inhuman. This is what I say, and I condemn the rich. Hugo Chavez in 2005.
And that is not all. In addition, whenever they have the opportunity, they also try to take over public agencies by placing their own loyalists in charge while promoting profound institutional changes. For example, have you ever wondered why Latin America is always debating new constitutions? Well, I think by now, you probably have an idea why. And keep in mind, in the last 20 years alone, we have seen significant constitutional changes in Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia, and Nicaragua, a failed attempt in Chile, and other minor changes in countries. So it's not really a laughing matter. Now wait a minute though, because we are not visual politic, but visual economic. And why do I say this? Well, because in addition to political traits, populism also has certain common characteristics of an economic nature. Take, for example, protectionism, agrarian reform, capital controls, nationalization of large companies, and generosity with public spending, among many other shared traits. In fact, populist movements have so many similarities between them that, as these two economists you see on the screen did for the first time in 1990, it is possible to divide the economic evolution of a populist government into 5 major phases. Well, these are the 5 stages of what could be called the Latin American disease, the failed strategy that, time and time again, causes this region to fall back into an inescapable pit. Well, the first phase occurs just before the populist leader takes power. It is the beginning of the whole process. The context is always very similar. The population is dissatisfied, the economy is not doing well, prices are rising, public services are of poor quality, corruption is widespread, and the general feeling is that the social elevator is completely broken. So you could say social frustration is growing and most people want an abrupt change. And guess what? This feeling is exploited by populism to point the finger at very specific culprits, those elites or big companies we were talking about before, and promise easy solutions. This is how they get into government, and once they take power, they start spending hand over fist, either by getting into debt or by using the banknote printing machine. This is, for example, exactly what happened in, you guessed it, Venezuela. The poor economic situation, the 30% increase in the price of public transportation, and the lack of prospects led to the 1989 Caracazo, a series of large protests that ended with more than 300 demonstrators dead. This was the beginning of a flame that led to an attempted coup d'etat headed by Hugo Chavez in 1992 in order to impose the Bolivarian Revolution, and it ended with this same character reaching the Venezuelan White House in 1999. As another example, this is also what happened in Argentina with the arrival of the Kirchners. The adjustments after the Corralito and the Great Crisis of 2001 and 2002 prepared the ground for the arrival of Ernesto Kirchner. But let's keep going. In the second phase, things are going full steam ahead. Populist leaders reach their zenith of popularity. The huge increases in spending and social plans of all kinds seems to support his or her discourse. Growth is accelerating, real wages are rising, jobs are being created, and the worst predictions are not being fulfilled. In the short term, the reduction of prices of public services and, if necessary, price controls even seems to improve the lives of both the middle classes and the poorer classes. Look at what Perón himself, one of the fathers of this whole political trend, has said.
My dear friend, give people, especially workers, as much as possible. When you feel you are already giving them too much, give them more. You will see the results. Everyone will try to scare you with the spectre of economic collapse, but it's all a lie. There's nothing more elastic than the economy, which everyone fears so much because no one understands it. Letter in 1952 from Juan Domingo Perón to the newly elected president of Chile, Carlos Ibáñez.
Well, in both Kirchner's Argentina and Chavez's Venezuela, economic growth soared during the first years. What's more, in these cases, the increases in public spending coincided with an enormous oil bonanza that multiplied public resources, particularly in Venezuela, of course. Look at this graph to see how Venezuela suddenly began to experience a huge economic boom. But exactly the same thing happened much further back in Andaluz, Chile, which grew by 9%, or in Peru during Alan Garcia's first term, which in 1986, after the first full year of his presidency, grew by 12%. Of course, all these successes only boost the leader's popularity and make him even more influential in his policies.
You are telling me that the bank is not for sale, but I can expropriate it now, immediately, if I want. Hugo Chavez in 2011 to the president of Banco Provincial, a subsidiary of BBVA in Venezuela.
But wait a minute, that's not the end of the story. The problem is that, far from improving the economy and despite the apparent growth, populist policies are gradually destroying the economic foundations of the country. Let me explain. The state tends to expel private enterprises. Subsidies adulterate the price system, spending is financed with debt or with the money printing machine, price regulation and capital controls damage national competitiveness, new public enterprises are terribly inefficient and loss-making, imports feed a huge foreign hole, inflation enters the scene, and legal security begins to disappear. But of course, a populist will do everything possible to stay in power, right? By the way, in past videos here on Visualeconomik, we have already told you in detail about the effects of price controls and why countries with many natural resources do not always do as well as we might think. Be that as it may, the point is that the growth of these countries with new populist leaders never lasts very long, and in a short time, this is where the third phase comes into play, it disappears completely. For example, in Kirchner's Argentina, the growing public deficit gave way to rampant inflation and subsequently to an enormous crisis that has decimated the standard of living of Argentines. In Venezuela, the fall in oil prices made the Bolivarian model completely unviable, and the country then entered into one of the greatest processes of impoverishment and economic collapse ever experienced. And do you remember the graph of Venezuela's GDP that we saw a moment ago? Well, look how things have changed in a short period of time. Of course, faced with this drift, populist governments try to do more of the same, but with more intensity, more capital controls, multiple exchange rates, more price controls, more taxes, the list goes on. It's like pouring gasoline on an open flame. Even in the worst cases, their popularity falls so fast that it causes governments to play dirty. For example, with 1,000 motives, it is not unusual for them to try and get their hands on the courts, the media, or even the opposition. It is also common for corruption cases to multiply in the face of the imminent loss of political power, and all of this only makes things even worse. This is the fourth phase, and what can I tell you? For example, in Venezuela, the disaster was so intense that inflation exceeded 130,000% in 2018. But take note, because the Argentina of the Kirchners and the Venezuela of Chavez and Maduro are by no means an exception. Practically all populist cycles in Latin America have ended in the same way. Look, for example, at Peru during Alan Garcia's first term. While in 1986 it grew 12%, just 2 years later, in 1988, the country was already in recession. And that was not the worst of it. The public deficit exceeded 10% of the GDP in 87, 88, and 89. A huge budget gap that ended up causing a 700% hyperinflation in 1990, along with widespread impoverishment. And so we arrive, sooner or later, to the fifth phase. Things now are so bad that it is practically time to wipe the slate clean. This, of course, usually corresponds, when possible, to a new government coming in. Adjustments are very hard, so poverty is relentless, and the country has to resort to the support of institutions such as the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. The poor usually end up poorer than at the beginning of the whole populist cycle, so it is not surprising that this triggers new waves of social discontent that pave the way for the arrival of a new messiah, and then we are back to square one.
When a jurist tells me, Evo, you're making a legal mistake, what you are doing is illegal, well, I put it in, even if it is illegal. Then I tell the lawyers, if it's illegal, you legalize it. What have you studied for? Evo Morales, the former president of Bolivia.
Of course, some changes have occurred over time. For example, in the so-called second-generation populism, which has occurred mainly since the 1990s, with the exception of Venezuela, cases of hyperinflation are less frequent. Aware of the risk of printing more and more banknotes, governments have turned to borrowing, thus increasing the national debt. This is what has happened in the last 2 decades in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Nicaragua. Argentina, for its part, remained a mixed case. They also tend to try to keep up appearances more when it comes to taking full control of institutions, and are more timorous when it comes to calling for a revolution, and rely heavily on regulating everything that can be regulated, and then some. For example, they love minimum wage increases. That's usually one of their big flags. Want some facts? Well, take a look. According to the UN Economic Commission for Latin America, the real minimum wage increased in Bolivia by 133% between 2005 and 2017. In Ecuador, it increased by 67% during the Carrera administration, and in Nicaragua, it increased by 75% between the years 2006 and 2017. The problem is that these minimum wage increases are not usually linked to increases in productivity or international competitiveness, so it is not usual that they end up causing serious economic problems in the end. Whatever the case, in one form or another, these 5 phases we have seen tend to repeat themselves constantly in all populist cycles in Latin America. This is nothing less than the development of the Latin disease. But do you want a concrete example of a second-generation populism? Well, let's take a look at Daniel Ortega's Nicaragua. Check this out.
Following the good populist playbook.
The Republic of Nicaragua is the largest country in Central America. It gained independence from Spain in 1812, and with a GDP per capita of just over $2,000 today, it holds the dubious honor of being one of the poorest countries in all of Latin America. In nominal terms, it is, in fact, the second poorest country in the region. Well, the country is tightly controlled by the tandem formed by Daniel Ortega as president and his wife Rosario Murillo as vice president. This is a textbook case of a populist cycle that, in addition, has ended up devouring the democratic system itself to give way to a fully fledged dictatorship. Demonstrations are repressed, political opponents are persecuted, the police act practically without limits, and elections are a joke. And that's not even talking about the economy. But how and when did this whole story begin? Well, let's see. After a bloody civil war, Daniel Ortega himself was president from 1985 to 1990. However, that year, his party, the Sandinista National Liberation Front, lost the elections. So between 1990 and 2006, the governments of Violeta Chamorro, Arnaldo Alemán, and Enrique Balanos, well, let's just say they apparently did their homework. The country had stability. International reserves multiplied, inflation remained stable, and the control of public spending caused the external debt to be reduced. Good things, right? However, what was not reduced was poverty, nor inequality, nor corruption. In 2006, Nicaragua was considered one of the 30 most corrupt corrupt countries in the world, and 48.3% of the population remained in poverty. To top it all off, oil prices skyrocketed from $40 in the summer of 2004 to over $70 in the spring of 2006. And of course, with these prices, it's not surprising that according to a Gallup poll in the same year, 2006, 73% of Nicaraguans thought that things were not going in the right direction. A sentiment that created the perfect breeding ground for the return of who else but Daniel Ortega, who of course won the next election. At the beginning, Ortega was very restrained and maintained a discourse focused on peace, love, and political reconciliation. The second-generation populism that we mentioned before, there was no need to scare anyone away. And of course, underlying everything were the same ideas: the calls for social justice, for an end to neoliberalism, the need to protect the people from the wicked, and all of the rest. And to tell the truth, there were those who had no doubt.
The great Sandinista victory fills our people with joy, and at the same time it fills the terrorist and genocidal government of the United States with opprobrium. Fidel Castro, dictator of Cuba, 7th of November 2006.
Well, once in power, the Ortega government did two things. On the one hand, it fueled public spending with large social plans, such as the Zero Hunger program, which further boosted the government's popularity.
Those who were hungry wanted to receive the benefits of the Zero Hunger program. Those who were sick wanted to receive the free medical assistance declared by the Ortega government in 2007. And those who did not have a roof over their heads wanted to receive the zinc roof tiles of the Plan Teco program. Andres Perez Baltodano, political scientist.
These plans were largely financed by Venezuelan petrodollars. In fact, Venezuela's congressional loans to Daniel Ortega's government exceeded $7.2 billion, more than half of the country's GDP. So of course, in Nicaragua, everything started to revolve around the government. In addition, the other thing Ortega did was to begin purging all non-Sandinistas from the institutions and reforming the constitution at will. Since the economy was rebounding thanks to the economic stimulus plans, this process was made a lot easier. These are the first and second stages we saw earlier. Not that things improved much in this case either, but in the following 3 years, poverty was reduced by almost 6 points. And not surprisingly, that made many politicians and the media paint Ortega as a model for stability. What the Nicaraguan government did not do, however, were things like improving national competitiveness, encouraging foreign investment, or the productive modernization of the economy. But that was the least of it. So the question is, do you know what happened next? Well, when the Venezuelan money disappeared in 2017, the economy started to collapse. The phase 3 that we were talking about before, and do you want proof? Well, take a look at this. In the following 3 years, more than 100,000 Nicaraguans began an enormous exodus to the United States. So what happened when things started to go wrong? Well, in this case, when the president's popularity began to plummet, Ortega wiped out the already meager democracy. In 2018, repression became the country's new political standard. So you see, another textbook example of how the Latin curse has swallowed up yet another country in the region. But having reached this point, now it's over to all of you. Do you think that Latin America will manage to overcome this disease and reach full development soon? How do you think this populist dynamic can be conquered? Which countries do you think will be the next ones to fall into the trap? Leave us your thoughts in the comments below and let's open a respectful debate. And if you found this video interesting, don't forget to subscribe to all of us here at Visualeconomik. All the best, and I'll see you next time.